What do you get when you combine Netflix, Ryan Gosling, Captain America, the Russo Brothers, and $200 million? Well, you get a nice heaping of mediocrity that is The Gray Man. Netflix's latest spy caper is lifted from the pages of Mark Greaney's novel about a freelance assassin who's a combination of Jason Bourne and a literal superhero, and it does exactly what you would expect a Netflix adaptation of such a thing to do. I'd say this movie is really not at all removed from the likes of Six Underground or Red Notice in that it doesn't do anything to push the genre forward, nor does its filmmaking or the quality of its set pieces justify its price tag. Let me get something straight. Those other two movies are atrocious, whereas The Gray Man is fine, enjoyable. It's fun even at times. That being said, let me just reiterate. You heard me right at the start. The Gray Man cost $200 million to make, and it looks like this. I think maybe this movie showcases the Russo brothers' biggest pitfall as directors. They need quality control, or at least how to stretch a small budget. Cherry was a mess of unrestrained vision, the result of the Russos hyperactively throwing every single visual idea they had at a wall, hoping some of it would stick, only for none of it to really come together. It seemed to be the product of two filmmakers trapped within the confines of Feige and company, finally getting to go buck wild with every single possible visual trick they had at their disposal. Cherry was over-directed. The Gray Man, on the other hand, feels like Netflix mandating them to give us what you did with The Winter Soldier, only this time they didn't have Marvel or Kevin Feige behind them guidelining the shape of the action sequences. They might have had the same level of VFX behind them, but VFX can only do so much if the vision isn't there, and I don't think the Russo brothers possess such a strong visual mind for action in their own right. I mean, a lot of the reason the action in The Winter Soldier is as good as it is because we got the guys from John Wick to choreograph the action sequences. Obviously, Gosling, Chris Evans, and Ana de Armas, hell, even the Russos themselves ate up a sizable chunk of that $200 million budget. The rest of it just wasn't spent well. I'm still scratching my head at the fact that this is a $200 million what? And like with Cherry, the Russo brothers just don't know how to properly communicate the things they want to say in their stories. Cherry is ostensibly them making a movie addressing the opioid epidemic in the Midwest, but they don't actually say anything about that issue except to confirm that it exists, and it's very sad, because the movie itself is entirely focused on its hyper-stylized visuals and trying in vain to win Tom Holland accolades. I don't want to harp on how disappointing Cherry was. I have a whole video dedicated to the missed opportunity that was that film, but it's nonetheless frustrating that I'm sitting here talking to you all about similar issues with The Gray Man. The best thing about the movie, though, is how Ryan Gosling asks Chris Evans, "Hey, aren't you supposed to be America's ass?" And Evan replies, "Hey, aren't you supposed to be saving Hero Wars from the dreadful archdemon, the sponsor of today's video?" With Hero Wars, you're gonna need a team of your own to get it done. It's gonna take more than the Grey Ken himself to accomplish your quest. If you're struggling to make up your mind, I recommend Celeste. She'll be a perfect fit in any team. Next, try challenging an opponent online to see what you're capable of. Claim the rewards, and don't forget to level up and get prepared for the ultimate battle. Remember, even the most dangerous boss can be brought down with the right team, and you yourself can feel like the formidable Sierra 6 taking down the infamous Lloyd Hansen. Join the game now and get a super chest with 5 top heroes, one of them is secret, as well as 600 emeralds and 30,000 gold. This game is available on any device. Just scan the QR code and tap the link in the description and start playing now. And we'll see you in Hero Wars, and thank you so much to Hero Wars for sponsoring this video. Right, what was that about Chris Evans' ass again? Ah, yes, okay. The Gray Man is another go for them at an action spy political thriller, but similar to Cherry, with little to no ideology behind it. It's just a thriller set among the inner workings of a government, and you know what, yeah, that's fine, you can have fun with it, it's disposable, but it's a far stretch from the great political thrillers of the 70s, like 3 Days of the Condor or The Manchurian Candidate. Similar to The Winter Soldier, a film I love dearly and still consider to be the best film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they play the messaging safe, over-relying on the trappings of a political thriller while largely missing the substance that makes the subgenre as riveting as it is. We wind up with a vapid message that's about as broad as a Miss America statement that can be warped and twisted to conveniently fit any cause from any side. The Winter Soldier can and has certainly been accused of being too non-committal, unclear from an ideological point of view, but the difference between a film like that and The Gray Man is that film at least has Captain America, whose ideology strategy should be clear to everyone to ground which side the film is on. Despite its vagueness, it has the character and his distrust of the government to create a compelling case, to the point where even if the filmmakers are a bit too ambiguous about the statements they're trying to make, you can pretty much gather what they're trying to say because of Steve and his beliefs. The Gray Man, true I suppose to its title, doesn't even sit firmly on the fence. It's just there. And when you don't have a pre-established character with a core set of beliefs to anchor you, the ambiguity becomes boring. At least the Winter Soldier isn't pretending to be anything more than a comic book movie genre smash. The Gray Man truly has no excuse for offering next to nothing after its filmmakers paraded it around like it was some big revival of the subgenre. It's not necessarily a bad thing to make a movie that turns off its own brain for the sake of entertaining an audience, but it gives their political thriller less staying power because it has nothing but broad strokes to say. And even then, The Gray Man can't make up for its shortcomings in the writer's room because, again, this is what it has to offer from an aesthetic perspective. I feel like you could describe The Gray Man as having a harmless early 2000s charm in its schlockiness and simplicity, but this was a movie whose source material, cast, and filmmaking team, yes, the Russos, who I feel are capable of much better, promised more than we got. I think The Gray Man's core problem, the empty, not even a proper glance way in which it explores not even its deeper ideas and themes, but its surface-level story, makes itself apparent from its first frames. In all of, a minute? This convict with about 30 years left on his sentence signs over his soul to the CIA in return for getting out of prison. We see this man's face, he chews a piece of bubblegum, he trades a couple of witticisms with Billy Bob Thornton, and then we jump forward 20 years into the main plot. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I enjoy a good prologue, especially if it's going to properly introduce us to the character, but we don't really get any of the dots connected about who this guy is, why he got sentenced to 35 years when he was only about 14 or 15, how that translated into him being a perfect killing machine. None of that's important, I guess, maybe. I mean, at least later on we find out about Six's abusive past and how he killed his dad to protect his brother, and obviously it's fine for a character to have some mystery about them, but I almost wonder if the movie would have been better just starting off with the Bangkok mission. Now, in fairness, you can sort of see why the Russos were drawn to this particular spy thriller. The hero has a working class edge to him, a second chance at redemption after a tough upbringing, a background tied to what seems to be middle America. The Russos vibe with that because of their Midwestern Ohio roots, and it was actually something they were fascinated in exploring with Cherry, which they've spoken extensively about how that affected their upbringing and their relationships with other people, and their relationships with their friends or people they knew who fell victim to that horrible crisis, or a guy who's been forced to sell his soul as a triggerman for the government, having this sort of self-realization that what he's doing is wrong, that he's being ordered to kill people who are innocent. That's interesting. That's what gives their brand of filmmaking this unique Midwestern angsty edge that sets them and the stories they're telling apart from your typical coastal filmmakers. The problem is, the Russos see that idea and then forget to actually explore it. This leaves me with two possible takeaways. Either the Russos don't know how to properly articulate the ideas they're interested in, and I mean that as no slight to them, it's not easy to convey how you're feeling or the ideas that you're mulling over to an audience, but it has to be said. Or the Marvel machine has neutered them as they're only used to providing a certain level of narrative depth in their stories. Something I'll at least credit the Russos for giving lip service to, even if only that, is something adjacent to the idea of how easy a jump it is from someone growing up in a Midwest working class environment to being a foot soldier and pawn for the government. At no point during that arc does that person hold any of the power. The elites in charge do. And so through the villains of Carmichael, Lloyd, Suzanne, who all went to Harvard together, a certain disdain comes through for East Coast Ivy Leaguers, at least the ones who are outward elitists, people who have never tasted desperation or understand how the world really works at a salt-of-the-earth ground level. This could easily be misconstrued, but it's clear that the Russos aren't particularly interested in being partisan, which is a shame. I think there's a lot they could say if they actually took the time to mind the politics of, I don't know, the political thriller they're making. They kind of have their cake and eat it too by dedicating all of 50 words to the idea across the entire script, while also trying to distract from how hollow the movie really is by inserting some overblown action every few pages and then spending a disordinate amount of time with it. But what are they trying to say here? What message is there, even if it's undercooked to the point of giving the audience the screenwriting equivalent of food poisoning? Well, Carmichael is very clearly your typical Harvard elitist, but they don't really delve too much into his political beliefs, probably because he has none. And I guess it doesn't really matter whether he's left-leaning or right-leaning, it's moot because he's just self-serving. Lloyd, on the other hand, very clearly represents a certain type of douche bro who tries to act like he's one of the people, that he too hates the wealthy elite. But the problem is, he is one of them. He went to Harvard. He's had a privileged life. He takes advantage of the lack of regulations that working in the private sector affords him and gets everyone else to do his work for him until it's literally placed right in front of him. It would have been nice to get some nuance here, explore the idea of these bipartisan elitist relationships and how they ultimately don't give a shit about ideology or beliefs, but rather only themselves and how they can attain and leverage power. If you're playing in the sandbox of this genre, don't just make a pastiche. I mean, you can, I guess. Hell, this film did, but even most films that do are still deeper than The Gray Man. Actually tell a story that invokes the feeling of that genre, not just the aesthetics. I think it's the weakness of the Russo brothers as storytellers. They only have to do the bare minimum and then lean into this is a political thriller or this is an action spy thriller in the marketing, so the audience is already subconsciously thinking about that when they go in. And so they subsequently just go, oh yeah, that feels like a political thriller, and won't question the actual narrative depth. The depth is what really gives those classics they so revere an added layer. It's what keeps them in the conversation because they're engaging in it. They have something to say, even if it isn't anything new or whatnot. The Russos paint in broad strokes, and while you can get away with it in a superhero blockbuster, when your film is a spy thriller, you have to do more. The Gray Man isn't just an MCU pastiche of a genre, it actually is part of the genre. The Gray Man strives to give audiences airport thriller vibes in terms of the melodrama, the story, the self-seriousness towards the top, which thankfully pivots to pseudo-meta camp as the film goes on. It's all very Ludlum-born. Corruption and collusion within the agency, the higher-ups trying to cover their tracks by eliminating the Sierra agents and destroying the evidence, you know, the whole thing that we've seen a million times before, done far better. I mean, the movie barely hits the 5-minute mark before we get some super cheesy version of "look what they make you give" speech from The Bourne Identity. The movie doesn't earn this moment. It doesn't make you think you understand how the Sierra program works, only to pull the rug out from under you. It just very suddenly throws Six into the Bourne supremacy without taking the time or any of the effort to first invest you in him. The only thing the opening of the movie takes any time to actually establish is its first hint that Six is a killer with a heart of gold, or whatever, at least he's got a conscience or moral code. His target's in sight. Carmichael demands he takes the shot, but Six refuses to take the shot due to the potential of collateral damage, aka an innocent child in the way. That ties into the story with Claire later on, although the movie similarly undercooks her character and her relationship with Six. The movie forgets for long stretches that Claire is even important, but again, we'll get to that. Carmichael's motto is simply to take out bad guys carrying bad shit, or bad guys doing bad shit, aka do what you're told, shoot first, don't ask questions, you're nothing more than a trigger man, barely a person, an asset. When you stop being an asset, you're no longer of use. The unfortunate side effect of Six choosing to be Fitz's Gray Man is that when they created the program, they didn't necessarily come up with an exit strategy before the whole thing was discontinued. While he's literally out of prison, he's permanently stuck in his occupation and will either have a bounty put on his head, will get killed in action, or will be returned to prison one day. There's no real way out in his line of work, and he knows it. It's sort of the melancholy of it all. He'll always be running, always be looking over his shoulder. And Carmichael's whole vendetta against the Sierra agents is due to the fact that they're former criminals. He looks down on them, sees them as nothing more than society's deplorables with nothing to offer, people who have made their choices and should face the consequences. He views them all as a monolith instead of looking at each person and learning why they were imprisoned in the first place. Have they changed? Are they good people? Carmichael doesn't care because he only sees them as a liability. And yet, in a time of crisis, he resorts to a sociopath like Lloyd Hansen, who got fired from the agency after 6 months because he got too extreme. He got bored with following the rules and regulations and charted his own path, his own way of conducting business that centers around elaborate, unsanctioned torture, relishing in violence, asserting a predator-like ego over prey. Lloyd got into the spy equivalent of the private sector, only in this line of business, there's really no rules, no regulations, restraints. He doesn't belong to a nation or a flag, and he can play as dirty as he desires. I mean, it's pretty straightforward and surface level, but it does tie into that idea of the Ivy League elites being the bad guys here. Carmichael looks down on ex-convicts working for the agency who might come from less wealthy parts of the United States, but he'll happily embrace Lloyd, who is a flat-out piece of shit. And speaking of Lloyd, dude, Chris Evans is having a great time on screen. He brilliantly plays against type and might be the standout of the film, but the character is just ridiculous down to the way he talks. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it makes you roll your eyes, but it's still entertaining regardless. But back to the dialogue. So much of the dialogue in this film is just absurd or overwritten and campy, and that is most apparent whenever Lloyd opens his mouth. Maybe it's purposely done. I have no idea. I have to imagine the Russos and Marcus and McFeely understood that a certain level of silliness and camp were required to give this an old-fashioned political thriller feel. That being said, sometimes there is a disconnect between the incredibly self-serious tone of the political spy thrillers of the 2000s that they sometimes go for and the more jovial, campy ones of the 80s. Hell, even just the dialogue from classic films of the 70s and before. It's the Russos' spy thriller tribute, even more than The Winter Soldier was. That's great, but I also think this may have been a case where they loved the genre too dearly and couldn't pick a specific direction with, and so, like how Cherry represented them throwing every kind of filmmaking tactic they knew at the wall, The Gray Man is them throwing everything spy at the wall, and the movie only winds up feeling more generic as a result, more broad. It's also what causes a disconnect between the cinematic language of the film, the music, cinematography, plot, and the characters and dialogue. Thankfully, a lot of these issues are only present in the first third, and the rest of the movie kind of just irons out the kinks as it finds its footing. Something that accentuates the Gray Man's problem is that watching it feels like reading a book. And sure, the film's adapted from one, but the two mediums function differently. Scene breaks in a film don't work the same as chapter breaks in a novel, where you can jump from place to place or time to time in the latter. It's jarring in a film to just slap scenes next to one another without any thought for the transition. This is most apparent in the extended flashback to Six's time protecting Claire. It comes almost out of nowhere and then hijacks the film for more than 10 minutes. The whole babysitting mission for Six feels in stark contrast to the whole man on the run thing that was previously going on. The film almost takes on a new objective entirely. I guess they kind of connect the two aspects in the end, but it's a little messy. It's nice to get a small taste of Carmichael and Fitz's working relationship and power games under the CIA, with the leaking of Fitz's address and then Carmichael not allowing for the protection of Claire. It's another glancing look at the agency, government, and their stooges, so arrogant and obsessed with their own success that they'll play dirty and go low in order to get ahead and eliminate the competition. We also get a nice but super on-the-nose scene where Six explains his tattoo of Sisyphus and the rocks to Claire, symbolic of his own situation where he's doomed to be a government-sanctioned killer for the rest of his life, pushing the boulder up an insurmountable hill. There's no subtlety to this parallel, and I mean, that's fine, but I wish if they were going to go there that they would harp on that imagery, that they would harp on this idea of a guy wanting to get out of this line of work, but keeps going back down the hill. It's really not given the time needed in order to be as impactful as it could be. Still, for as jarring as this flashback is, you do at least get the sense that Six, being a loner in his field, values the warmth of a family and will fight to protect them at all costs. He and Claire also share a life of hardships. Claire with her heart problems and Six being imprisoned and now indebted to a lifetime of being an assassin. And it's what allows them to better understand and relate to one another. I loved this. It was a great dynamic. It also becomes more resonant when we're introduced to Six's abusive upbringing. His dad being this big, macho, toxically masculine figure that towered over him and his brother's life, taught them to fight through fear and pain no matter what, but at the expense of morals and a certain level of humanity. He becomes as much of the bully as the people he's trying to teach his sons to fight against. Six finds warmth, family, humanity, and hope through Claire. His protective instincts kick in. He may be a killer, but he's ultimately a good guy, and his relationship with Claire makes him less cold. I loved this aspect of the film. I think it's where you could tell the Russos were most passionate about exploring, and thus it winds up being the most effective emotional aspect of the Gray Man. And look, obviously this isn't a new thing. I mean, the name of the film is The Gray Man. He's still killing people, and sometimes I think the film tries to go out of its way to overly justify his actions, turning him somewhat into a superhero-ish protagonist instead of a more complex espionage corrupted one who has flaws given the nature of his work and engaging with those flaws in the gray area they operate in rather than brushing them aside. It's a big part of what makes this film a less interesting take on the genre. We know Six is the good guy, but why not explore the fact that he's still a killer who has a code or whatever? Engage properly with that trope. How does it make him feel? How does killing make him feel? Does it take a toll? Is he regretful despite the fact that he's no longer in prison? There's another added element that they could really chew on. The idea that if he decides not to kill, he's damned to a lifetime in prison versus working as an assassin. So he has to almost compromise a part of himself. But, you know, this is a PG-13 popcorn flick, so instead the film makes him a non-stop killing machine, trying to insist that he's not only a badass, but is always doing the right thing by killing. Don't question it, just watch him. Shoot, 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 stab, 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 explode, explode, explode. The action sequences, yes! The Russos really only care about depth in this movie to a certain extent, and then they take a step back and they're like, okay, I think that's good enough. We really don't need to go much further. It's disappointing because Six is such an interesting character. Hell, all of the characters in this film have the potential to be truly interesting in this political espionage thriller that they've constructed. The reason why the Bourne films or the Bond films, hell, even the John Wick films succeed at this is because they engage with the idea that these guys are killers. How do they feel about their occupation? What kind of toll does it take on them? Anyways, let's talk about the action sequences. The action sequences are the Gray Man at its most brainless, and there are just so many of these set pieces that the movie is clearly just using them as a crutch. And, you know, that's fine. I don't really have too much of a problem with that, and they're all mostly enjoyable, but they should probably make sure that if they're going to be using these action sequences as the main draw, that those sequences are at least well executed, right? Like, how do these sequences look so bad? How can this be the selling point? How can this movie cost so much money and yet have a sequence like the atrocious plane escape? Gosling and the other dude falling out of the sky looked like the balloon men from The Matrix Reloaded, on top of the whole thing just being absolutely incomprehensible. It's definitely a low point for the film, and I just can't believe that it made it all the way into the final cut looking as bad as it did. That being said, the other action sequences are fine. Yeah, there's some shoddy green screen, especially when Ryan Gosling is jumping off of a bus that really should have used some work. I mean, it's not enough to take you out of the film like that plane jump, but it's definitely disappointing considering the budget and the resources. Like, it's fun enough, it's good enough, but a movie like this should be much more than just good enough. It also doesn't help that apparently there was originally a far more violent R-rated cut of this film that Netflix hack and slashed in order to give it a broader appeal and a PG-13 rating. You can definitely tell where gunshots, stabs, and punches were supposed to pack a serious wallop, and you can feel them having to cut around it, which adds to the chaos of it all. Some sequences are better than others, depending on what weapons Six is using, and I guess just the nature of the sequence itself, but it's absurd. This is a Netflix movie. It's going to streaming. It has America's ass with a mustache. People are going to watch it. You don't need to hold back in the same way Disney Plus does. Plus, if it's on Netflix, people don't really give a shit if something is R-rated or not. In fact, full disclosure, I have a friend who saw a test screening of this film and described to me what happened and the way the action originally played out. He basically said that the plane sequence looked about as bad as it did in that test screening, which is really disheartening, but the action was way more cohesive, way more comprehensive, and so badass. He came out of that film saying, this is probably the best action movie the Russo brothers have ever made. So when I went into this film, I realized, oh, no, Netflix hack and slash this thing to shit, and that's why some of the action isn't great. So for as much as it's easy to blame the Russos for the editing and badly composed sequences, I truly think this was a Netflix interference that led to all the messy action in the final product, which is probably why I'm being a bit kinder to the action in the film. It's still enjoyable. Like, I still have a good time with it, but I completely know that there is a better version of all of these sequences that exists, and that's the frustrating part. Now, all of that being said, I'll at least concede this. Cheesy looking tram escape aside, I think the Vienna sequence is a ton of fun. It's actually pretty ballsy to let such a sequence run upwards of 20 minutes in a film like this, and to its credit, I don't think this section really ever runs out of steam. Maybe Alfre Woodard is owed the praise, but there's a genuine resonance to her self-sacrifice in the way the sequence keeps escalating from that explosion onwards. It's actually kind of entertaining how Lloyd continuously sends in excessive amounts of assault teams, all converging on the square where Six is handcuffed to a bench or whatever. He brings all this firepower, all the manpower, all of these grunts with guns, and can't even kill a handcuffed Six. It's exhilarating, fun, explosive. You feel the frustration of Lloyd, and it's hilarious. You see the skill set of Six put on full display, and it's so badass, especially because we've never really seen Ryan Gosling be an action lead like this. There's some really great stunt work here as well. It's just a cool set piece from conception to execution. And I'll even throw the movie a bone and say that the ineptitude of these converging strike teams compared to the skill, judgment, morals, and mental strength of one man like Six proves his value over loud, overly aggressive, impatient, and impulsive men with a chip on their shoulder like Lloyd. This one scene really spells out the entire game of wits, their entire dynamic, and why the agency will always be better with people like Six in the field than with Lloyd Hansen types blowing up shit ad nauseum in a foreign country, making a scene without a care as to the international crisis he may or may not instigate. I wish the rest of the film managed to maintain the energy it had in Vienna, though. For one, it definitely feels like they didn't quite know what to do with Miranda for a lot of the back half of the film. It's very unfortunate, too, as Ana de Armas is ultimately kinda wasted. I mean, she just spends the finale shooting grenade launchers and rocket launchers and stuff, and then her character makes a quiet exit. You almost wonder if she needed to be there at all. Yeah, she gets the little data drive back, but then the film does nothing with that MacGuffin anyway. Carmichael and Suzanne get no comeuppance in the end, and all three characters end off the film deeply unresolved, which I guess is the point. Status quo remains. The people who should be in prison won't be, the typical endings of these sort of films. But The Gray Man is so non-committal and broad in what it wants to say that it, yet again, lacks the punch of films like The French Connection or what have you. I guess at least we get that final confrontation between Lloyd and Six in a maze, which is a nice little nod to The Shining, but it offers one final affirmation of who Six is and why he has more value than 1,000 arrogant, loud, dickhead Lloyds. Lloyd makes a big show out of him being better, but for Six, this is just another mission. Just another asshole with everything to lose and prove. Six doesn't need to prove anything because he already has, time and time again. It's senseless. This is just another Thursday, as the film puts it. Lloyd even has to break out a knife and fight dirty to have a chance at winning. He's the same toxic, masculine bully Six's father was. And you know what? If the film let Six defeat Lloyd himself, then fair enough. That's a nice little bow on the little bits of commentary the Russos were trying to mine from The Gray Man. But the decision the film instead makes to have Suzanne show up out of thin air and just suddenly shoot Lloyd is not only unsatisfying as a conclusion to this brutal fight, it muddies up the ending the film was headed towards. Hell, the movie even made it seem like Suzanne got blown to Kingdom Come earlier on. What would have happened if Six simply killed Lloyd? Well, it's impossible to say definitively unless we get our hands on some version of the script where that happens, but for my money, it looks something like Six going on the run with Claire in the aftermath of all the carnage, which is how the movie ends anyways. It's like the film becomes a Captain America-esque superhero flick with the virtuous hero taking down the bad guy who not only poses a physical threat to the people our hero cares about, but to the values he holds dear and has to take him down. Only it forgets it's actually an espionage political thriller and shoehorns in the forgotten threads of the element at the 11th hour just to say they did it. And in shaking things up, all you get is an unsatisfying run-on mess of an ending. No final statement on the little tiny morsel of a thematic idea the Russo brothers managed to incorporate into the film. No memorable final impression. I know I've been a bit harsh on this film, but The Gray Man isn't a complete disaster. I honestly had fun watching it as a surface-level, disposable disposable action spy thriller, but that's really all it is. Disposable, empty calories, filling all else. It at least has that sequence in Vienna. Some funny zingers from a deliciously douchey Chris Evans playing against type. Ryan Gosling is solid as always, and even through his stoic man of few words veneer, manages to slip in some of that signature warmth and charm that help liven up what would otherwise be a rather cold character. And there were some genuinely funny bits. Seriously, I laughed a few times during this film. But for $200 million, for what should have been the Russos returning to what you think would be their element, it's definitely a disappointment. I sincerely believe the Russo brothers are capable of more. I'm not ready like a lot of the other people are to dismiss The Winter Soldier as a fluke, and that movie will always be phenomenal no matter how many cherries or gray men come along. But I also think that maybe they need to admit that maybe they can't do all of this on their own. Maybe they need more voices in the room who they're not afraid to listen to properly. And maybe next time they try to make a movie like this, it won't just be another gray man.